The Security Cabinet met overnight to consider proposals for a ceasefire in Lebanon. The U.S. recently proposed ceasefire conditions to Israel and the Lebanese government. Diplomatic efforts have stepped up since Election Day in the U.S., with comments calling for a ceasefire in Lebanon coming from President-elect Trump. ILTV's Steve Leibovitz reports.
Israeli sources involved in the ceasefire talks are saying that there are not bad chances the sides can advance toward an agreement. Since the election of Donald Trump, there's been a flurry of messaging signaling that he wants the fighting over in Lebanon as soon as possible. A reported trip by Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer to Moscow has added to the speculation. Israel has expressed its war goal as reaching conditions for the return of Israelis safely to their homes in northern Israel. This would include the removal and disarming of Hezbollah to north of the Litani River. Hezbollah has yet to declare willingness to meet Israeli conditions. It was the first meeting of the Security Cabinet since the ousting of former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant and his replacement with Israel Katz. Only a few days on the job, Katz declared that Israel had defeated Hezbollah and the assassination of its leader, Hassan Nasrallah, was proof.
אנחנו ניצחנו את החיזבאללה, וחיסולו של נסראללה זו גולת הכותרת. עכשיו תפקידנו להמשיך בלחץ ולממש, וכאן נעבוד ביחד, ולממש את הפירות של הניצחון הזה, על ידי הבטחת שינוי המצב הביטחוני בלבנון.
A different message from IDF Chief Herzi Halevi, who approved preparations for the expansion of ground operations in South Lebanon as the army continues to confront Hezbollah forces on the ground and its rocket launching capabilities, with northern Israel targeted with rockets and drones daily. The Air Force continued pounding Hezbollah assets in multiple locations, including Beirut. Ground forces are continuing to dismantle underground terror infrastructure. A tunnel network was destroyed that went under a cemetery. Halevi said that he approved new plans for the IDF's Northern Command and expanded maneuvers, which would include thousands of permanent and reserve soldiers.
And a woman in her 40s was wounded by shrapnel this afternoon following a rocket impact in the area of Carmiel, one of some 50 rockets launched into the Galilee region. Israel was also targeted by UAVs from Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq. A ballistic missile from Yemen was successfully intercepted outside Israeli airspace, but not before setting off a red alert near Jerusalem. Air Force fighters were heard overhead as the drone incursions were detected. Shrapnel from an interceptor missile landed in Bet Shemesh, sparking a small fire. And overnight, the IDF shot down 4 drones from the east. The Iran-backed Islamic Resistance in Iraq claimed responsibility for the launching of the drones. 2 of the UAVs were intercepted outside Israeli airspace. A UAV was also intercepted coming from the direction of Lebanon. Sirens were triggered in the small Golan community of Ramat Trump, named in honor of Donald Trump during his first term in office. The area has been targeted 4 times since his election last week. And joining us now with more on the potential ceasefire in the works between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon is former chief analyst of military intelligence, foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Rabin, and a senior fellow at the Jerusalem Center for Foreign and Security Affairs, Colonel Jacques Neria. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So first of all, let's talk about the ceasefire that's in the works. Is Israel ready for such a ceasefire? Has the IDF accomplished all of its goals in Lebanon?
Well, the main goal has not been attained. If we're talking about the 80,000 Israelis that have to come back to their homes, well, this is far from being realistic or being concrete. In any case, I mean, the conditions that Israel has set today concerning a potential ceasefire with Lebanon are totally unacceptable to the Lebanese. I mean, you're talking about the right of hot pursuit by Israeli forces inside Lebanese territory if there is a danger or there is a threat concerning Israel's security. You're talking about deploying international forces between Syria and Lebanon, just to stop the flow of weapons from coming from Iran into Lebanon. These conditions are not accepted by any Lebanese. It's not just Hezbollah. And then when you have to add something else. You have to add that most of the Lebanese are not all united against Hezbollah. You have at least 50% who are siding with Hezbollah, siding with its efforts. And then, concerning Hezbollah itself, Hezbollah is waging a war of survival. He knows very well, the organization knows very well that if such an agreement is reached, meaning that it has to deploy beyond the lines of the Litani, it means that it has no more value in defending Lebanon. It has no right to survive, and it has to give back all the weapons to the Lebanese army, because the Lebanese army will be deployed in South Lebanon. So in this case, Hezbollah is fighting for survival. The Lebanese are not united. The conditions put by Israel are unacceptable. So I think that right now the only one that is thinking that this can be done is our Minister of Defense, who has declared that we have won the war against Hezbollah.
So that actually leads me to my next question. The newly appointed Defense Minister, Israel Katz, has said that Israel has dismantled Hezbollah. So I want to ask, is this truly the case? Because the daily incoming rocket fire and Israel's northern residents, as you said, will tell you a different story.
Well, let's put that into real terms. The former defense minister said that Hezbollah has lost 80% of its potential, 80% of its arsenal, and is left with 20%. 20%? Okay, let's do the calculation. What's 20%? 20% is almost 40,000 rockets and missiles, ballistic missiles included, and all the rest. It means that Hezbollah can wage an attrition war against Israel for more than between 100 and 200 days more. This is not the end of it. So this is one. Second, out of 100,000 fighters that Hezbollah has lost, let's say, to about 2,500 men in combat, and about 10,000 wounded. Still, there's about 90,000 fighters that have not been involved in active warfare against Israel. And if we look at the scene in the South Lebanon, we see that most of the site where the Israeli forces reach, well, there's almost no battles, because Hezbollah just retreated ahead of time and is preparing for more incursions of Israel inside Lebanese territory, where he finds himself in a better position, and certainly in a superior position, facing Israeli forces in that case. Mm-hmm.
Now, I want to ask, because it's interesting to see that now that Trump has been elected, he's actually backing or requesting a ceasefire be in place by the time he takes office. That, at least, is what's being reported. There's tremendous international pressure on Israel, on Lebanon, to achieve a deal. Are you concerned that this will come at the expense of Israel's national security, especially if Lebanon refuses to accept the terms that Israel has laid out before it?
Look, what I know is the following, that Donald Trump has promised in a restaurant, in a Lebanese restaurant in Michigan, that he would, he would win the elections and be president, that he will reach a ceasefire. Not only a ceasefire, he will stop the war in Lebanon. And for this purpose, he has named an envoy. This is the father of his son-in-law, the Masad Boulos, a Lebanese Orthodox Christian. He is also, binational. And by the way, in 2009, he tried to be elected in the Lebanese parliament, and he is the one who is leading the efforts in order to reach an agreement. So the Donald Trump wants to. He has promised, so he wants to deliver. And this is the main issue here between Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. You don't talk to the American American president three times in a row without having, to hear from directives or the instructions or advices from the president. And this is why you hear in parallel that we are reaching a so-called agreement on the border with Lebanon. Let me add something else. Even if we succeed in convincing the Lebanese that the Israeli terms are the best of terms and they will accept it, we need a president in Lebanon to sign the agreement. Without a president in Lebanon, and this is not going to happen in the next few weeks, then there will be any agreement that is reached is invalid. It has it is worth only the paper it's signed on.
All right, well, Colonel Jacques Neria, thank you so much for your analysis today.
Thank you.
And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S. President-elect Donald Trump are not wasting any time, as Netanyahu said the two have spoken over the phone 3 times in the past few days. The two discussed the shared Iranian threat as the regime has vowed to strike Israel and as new details emerge on its role in the attempted assassination attempt of Trump. The details in the following report.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Sunday evening that he and President-elect Donald Trump see eye to eye on the Iranian threat.
בימים האחרונים אני שוחחתי 3 פעמים עם הנשיא הנבחר דונלד טראמפ. אלה היו שיחות טובות וחשובות מאוד. שיחות שנועדו להדק עוד יותר את הברית האיתנה בין ישראל לארצות הברית. אנחנו רואים עין בעין את האיום האיראני על כל מרכיביו ואת הסכנה שנשקפת ממנו. ואנחנו רואים גם את ההזדמנויות הגדולות שעומדות בפני ישראל בתחום השלום והרחבתו.
He made the statement as Iran has vowed a reprisal attack against Israel over its October 26 strike on the regime's air defense systems and missile and drone production facilities. During his first term in office, Trump took a hardline approach with Iran, pulling out of the JCPOA agreement, which both he and Netanyahu dubbed a bad deal, and enforcing sanctions against the regime, a position he has said he will continue to take during his second term in office. His return clearly has the regime concerned. Over the weekend, the U.S. Department of Justice revealed new details of Iran's assassination attempt on Trump. The Department of Justice said in a statement that ahead of the November 5th election, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps instructed an operative, identified as 51-year-old Farhad Shakeri, to monitor and devise a plan to assassinate Trump. He was also tasked with monitoring and assassinating 2 Jewish American citizens in New York. The DOJ said it also arrested 2 other operatives working with Shakeri, Jonathan Loadholt from Staten Island and Carlisle Rivera from Brooklyn. They were planning to assassinate an Iranian American citizen in New York. Loadholt and Rivera were detained and await trial, but Shakeri remains at large, most likely in Iran.
And in related news, President-elect Donald Trump has appointed Republican House Representative Elise Stefanik the role of U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Stefanik is a staunch supporter of Israel and has been leading efforts in Congress to address anti-Semitism on college campuses. Last year, she made headlines with her tough questioning of Ivy League presidents when she asked them to condemn the call for the genocide of Jews. They all refused, saying it was dependent on context. In a statement to the New York Post Sunday night, Trump said Stefanik is an incredibly strong, tough, and smart America First fighter. We wish her luck in her new role. And moving on, convoys of humanitarian aid trucks continue to provide aid to northern Gaza today. This as Israeli officials are reportedly concerned that the Biden administration is ready to carry out threats to condition receipt of U.S. weaponry on the delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza. More from ILTV's Steve Leibovitz.
Wednesday is the deadline for the 30-day U.S. ultimatum set by U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin to then Defense Minister Gallant and Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer. Israeli officials are indicating that the matter has yet to be resolved. Austin reportedly conveyed a sharp message to his new Israeli counterpart Israel Katz, saying that Israel risks jeopardizing the ongoing provision of U.S. weaponry for the Gaza war if it does not prove a dramatic improvement in the supply and distribution of aid to Gazan civilians. The U.S. explained its position, saying that Israel must fully facilitate aid into Gaza and that it's using U.S. weapons in accordance with international law. Meanwhile, the public broadcaster is reporting that Hamas has offered Fatah the responsibility of managing Gaza in its place. The offer would reportedly include border and security control in the enclave. If true, it's the first sign of Hamas' willingness to relinquish control in the Gaza Strip. Israel's war goals have included an end to Hamas military and civilian rule in Gaza. Israeli leaders have also rejected the notion of Fatah replacing Hamas. It's day 402 of the war in Gaza. Fighter jets carried out a targeted killing, eliminating Mohammed Abu Sahil, head of operations for Islamic Jihad in Gaza.
And it seems European leaders continue to turn a blind eye and appease the anti-Israel mob. In Amsterdam, despite a citywide ban on protests, hundreds of anti-Israel protesters gathered in Dam Square, facing no real consequences. Meanwhile, Israel is calling on its citizens to avoid traveling to upcoming sports games in Europe. The details in the following report. Police clashed with anti-Israel protesters in Amsterdam on Sunday, detaining more than 100 demonstrators. According to a police spokesman, they were not arrested, but rather put on buses and dropped off on the outskirts of the city. This despite hundreds of demonstrators openly defying the city ban on protests and gathering in the capital's Dam Square, waving Palestinian flags and chanting Free Palestine. Dutch authorities placed a ban on protests in the city until November 14th. The ban follows a night of anti-Semitic attacks on Thursday following the Ajax-Maccabi Tel Aviv soccer game, in which Israelis, including women and children, were hunted down in the streets of Amsterdam by mobs of Muslim immigrants in pre-planned and organized attacks. Meanwhile, the National Security Council has issued a warning urging Israelis to forgo the upcoming France-Israel soccer game in Paris, set for Thursday. The council said that in the last few days, calls have been identified among pro-Palestinian supporters of terror groups to harm Israelis and Jews. As such, it advised Israelis to avoid games and cultural events with Israeli participation. Paris police said on Sunday that they would be deploying thousands of officers in the stadium and around the city for the game on Thursday to ensure security for Israeli fans. And French President Emmanuel Macron announced he would attend the game. His office said that his participation is aimed at sending a message of fraternity and solidarity after the intolerable acts of anti-Semitism that followed the match in Amsterdam. And following the Amsterdam attacks last week and the continued threats of violence against Jews, is it safe for Israelis to travel to Europe? Joining me now to discuss the alarming rise in anti-Semitism across Western Europe is Israel's Special Envoy for Combating Anti-Semitism, Michal Kotler-Wunsch. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on.
So let's jump right in. Is it safe for Israelis to travel to Europe, or should they start looking for new travel destinations?
Look, it's not just about Europe. We have to be very, very clear. The pogrom that took place in Amsterdam should not be looked at just through the lens of Amsterdam nor Europe. It is part and parcel of an entire year of what is a tsunami of anti-Semitism in the aftermath of October 7th, the worst attack of Jews since the Holocaust, and the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism, including in its new strain, anti-Zionism that denies Israel's very right to exist. And it's not just about not traveling to Europe, because we have to be very, very clear. What is happening on the streets is happening in university campuses and is happening in sports events and in cultural events and in many, many manifestations. So actually, and I am a part of a coalition of special envoys from around the globe. And what is most critical, and I have said so to the rest of my colleagues as well, is that we expect not just words, but actions of governments that include the implementation of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, the result of a long democratic process that's been adopted by more than 40 countries, but that has to be implemented if we are going to be able to identify and combat what is running rampant in the streets that, as I said, in a premeditated and planned attack, targeted and attacked Israelis in the streets of Amsterdam, but without understanding that it is part and parcel of the anti-Zionism, this new strain of anti-Semitism that demonizes and delegitimizes and applies double standards to the state of Israel, we will not be able to put the genie back in the bottle that has been clearly unleashed around the world. I remind us In the United States, in Washington, the only kosher restaurant on the night of Kristallnacht, its windows were shattered. In New York City, visible-looking Jews, 6-year-old child was grabbed from his hand by a passerby. In Chicago, again, protests, outside of synagogues. In Montreal, in Toronto. And that is the moment that we're in. It's not just about traveling or not going to sports events. It is much larger. It is much bigger. And the genie being let out of the bottle, anti-Semitism unleashed in this way, is not just about Jews. It predicts a very, very real threat to the societies, to the places, and to the spaces in which it is thriving, it is infecting, it is spreading.
And so as you've detailed, we really do see an alarming rise in anti-Semitism throughout Western Europe, throughout the world. And we do know that this is in part or even mainly due to a large influx of Muslim immigrants, the vast majority of which have been indoctrinated with sort of an innate hatred of Israel, of the Jews, and as you mentioned, even of Western civilization or Western culture. And it seems that European governments are doing very little to combat this, opting instead to appease them, turning a blind eye to their violence on the streets, as we've seen and as you've detailed this past year. I mean, what do you make of this, and what can European governments do to regain the trust of their Jewish communities, of Israelis, and of the world in combating anti-Semitism?
So let's be very, very clear. Radical Islamism actually threatens the foundations of the societies in which it not only targets Jews. As I said before, anti-Semitism is a predictor. It's the most reliable predictor. And I did mention the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. It is a definition of anti-Semitism that anybody rolling out a national strategy or condemning these acts and then saying they are committed to combating anti-Semitism has to be able to identify it. And to identify it, you need to define it. That IRA working definition is a resource, but at this moment in time, without using it in every national strategy, university plan, law enforcement mechanism that actually intends to be able to identify the anti-Semitism that must be combated, that failure to use that definition will fail to be able to, as I said, put the genie back in the bottle. And yes, it is radical Islamists and jihadists and not pro-Palestinian protests. Let's be very, very honest and very, very clear. The protests or the encampments that hold up signs that say from the river to the sea are not pro-Palestinian. They are pro-terror. They are pro-Hamas. They are pro the murderous Islamic regime of which Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis are proxies. And the understanding that if we want to test it, we can just look at the lack of responses or the silence, if you will, to the hours and hours of footage of the torture of innocent civilians in Gaza by Hamas to understand that it is the West that's emboldening genocidal terror proxies and the Islamic regime of Iran, emboldening them. For them, human tragedy is the strategy. And the silence that we have witnessed, including, yes, you're right, in European countries, and the lack of implementation of that IRA working definition in all of those strategies is part and parcel for the mainstreaming of this anti-Semitism that makes it so dangerous, so lethal, as we said, in the streets of Europe, but also in the streets of North America and South America and Australia, not just for Jews and not just for Israelis, but for the spaces and places that allow this anti-Semitism to infect, to spread, and to become mainstream.
Absolutely. And first, we have to define it to be able to combat it. Michal Kotler-Wunsch, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us about this very important issue today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And now, let's take a look at the weather forecast. Light drops are expected around most of the country tonight, with lows around 15 degrees Celsius or 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Then tomorrow we'll see cloudy skies with highs of about 22 degrees Celsius or 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a wrap for today's news. For the latest updates from Israel on all your devices, be sure to follow our ILTV channel, subscribe to our newsletter, and explore our website, iltv.tv. Stay informed with the latest news straight from the heart of Israel. I'm Ladar Gravelazi. Be well, stay safe, and thank you so much for watching.